Hey guys, welcome back for another developer interview with a member of the team behind Dead Matter. I had a great time with this one and my guest was filled with knowledge and experience. I really felt like I was sitting down with someone who had mastered their craft in this one. Before I get started, a quick mention that if this is the first interview of mine you're seeing, I have quite a few more with the Dead Matter team on my Dead Matter playlist, so you can check those out anytime. It's also worth mentioning that I'll be streaming Dead Matter on Twitch as soon as we're able to, so if you want to drop my channel a follow, please feel free. With that out of the way, let's get into the reason you're here. Enjoy the interview. Okay, Mr. DCEdm, can you tell me a bit more about your role within the team and what you do for QI Software and Dead Matter?
Well, my main role is audio. I know that there was audio done by a previous developer, and they've cobbled together, sources from different places. But it's my job to, bring it all together as a cohesive unit. Upgrade, improve any sounds that I think need fixing. Also to add sounds in for content that hasn't been created yet.
Awesome.
So that's basically it. It's kind of the lead sound designer role.
Okay, awesome. So you've got a bit of a base layer to work with already then. Like there's a lot that's already been constructed and you've just kind of got to try to pull it all together, like you said.
Yeah. For instance, I've spent the last month redoing all the footstep sounds and for all the different materials, and that system is probably 90% done now. There's just a few more items that I have to add in there, but awesome. I'm hoping that the variety and the quality will make people happy.
I'm sure it will. If there's anything that I've learned from my interviews with the rest of the team so far, it's that you guys are incredibly passionate, and a lot of you have a good amount of experience, which brings me on to my next question. I hear that you're a little bit of an industry veteran, if you like. Can you tell me a bit about the work that you've done in the past, and is there any games that we might be familiar with in there?
Sure. I got my start in the industry. I was fortunate enough to do a bit of a work study for a course I was taking in IT, not audio, but I had a background in audio production. And I, went to BioWare, who were just working on Baldur's Gate 1 at the time, and I joined their team as an IT person, actually. So
okay.
And then they knew that I, had experience in the audio world, and they asked me if they knew anyone that could do some sound effects, because they had a project coming up, which was MDK2 for Interplay, but Interplay, who normally provided the sound, was unavailable at that point. So they needed somebody to do, placeholder sounds. And I volunteered. It was kind of trial by fire, because it was we were doing it for the Dreamcast, and we had to sort of learn things on the fly, and I like to tell the story that the timing on the PC that I was developing, and this will give you a context, I think I had like a Pentium 66.
Wow.
Like 66 megahertz or whatever. And I would actually edit right in the file for all the 3D, assets. So, if there was gunfire or whatever, I would actually put in the key, and then it would trigger the sound. So I was messing around with the 3D files. Anyway, so by the time Interplay got around to having some bandwidth available to help out the audio, they said, well, we can do this now, but Greg Zeschuk, one of the co-owners, had said, no, we're okay. We've got somebody in house, and they said the person that was in charge of the audio, his name is Charles Dean, and he's well known in the audio community, and he said, well, we'll see about that, and he listened to my sounds, and he said, well, they aren't bad, and keep going. And then somebody said to me, oh my God, you must think the sun shines out of your ass. And I said, what? Because I was devastated. I had put a lot of work into it. And he said, well, usually Charles just rips people to shreds. So, I was like, oh, okay, well. And then after a time, it got to the point where I was just doing so much audio stuff that I just, got moved from the IT department and was full-time audio. And from there, I worked on Baldur's Gate 2, Neverwinter Nights, Knights of the Old Republic.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. And my last project, there was Jade Empire, although I did work on Mass Effect 1, but I did that as an outside contractor because I had left the company to do freelance work.
Oh, okay.
So
awesome.
Kind of where I got started in the industry, and I've worked on various different projects, from there.
Yeah, that's amazing. I must admit, like, when I was obviously talking to Reggie a little bit, which I usually do before all of these interviews, just kind of get an idea of what your role is, so I can structure these questions that I like to ask in the interviews. And he told me about a couple of the games that you'd worked on in the past. So I must admit, I was very, I guess, I was both surprised and really pleased to hear about it, because for me, like in a survival game, like especially one like Dead Matter, which is so heavily focused on like immersion and that side of things, it's so nice to be able to be confident in the sound design going forward, because like it's such a big thing for me. And I'm like, Escape from Tarkov is the game that I always kind of compare things to, because I play it quite a lot. Their sound design, amazing, and it really does make a difference when you're when you're in that immersive environment trying to really get stuck into the game. So it's really good to hear that you've got so much experience kind of behind you, I guess.
Right. Right.
Okay.
Well, sound design is kind of a strange discipline. As one of my mentors told me once, good sound design should never stand out. It should just make everything else better. Excuse me a second. And his philosophy was, if he was in a mixing session, his background was film and TV, and somebody from the production company or what have you was in there, and they were like, oh, that's a good sound, or that's a good sound, he would go back and change it, because he thought that if you're concentrating on the sounds, then you're probably, I mean, not every time, but he would think, well, why does this stand out? Like, you shouldn't break the suspension of disbelief and the immersion through sound design. You should always make everything just be enhanced. And feel natural, feel like it belongs in the world.
Well, that's it, right? I think that's a really, really good way of looking at it, because essentially it's there to be it's there to be as if it were real, right? And if it were that way, then you wouldn't notice it so heavily. It wouldn't bring your attention unless it's something like a gunshot or something like that to draw you towards it, I guess. A lot of these things should just be.
I mean, even in that case, like the gunshot to draw you in is not it doesn't stand out per se in the world in terms of, like, people they're gonna notice the reason for the gunshot, but hopefully they won't be sitting there analyzing the quality of the gunshot itself.
Yeah.
As, it should just sound, it should sound good, and it should sound appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that way of looking at it. So awesome. So we know a little bit more about your role in the team. We know a little bit more about your background now. So now I kind of want to move on to Dead Matter itself and just kind of focus on what you're doing for the team and all that other sort of stuff. So when it comes to Dead Matter itself, what initially took your interest, and how did you end up joining the development team?
Well, I do a radio segment for CBC Radio here in Alberta.
Oh, that's awesome.
Every 2 weeks. Yeah, it's just, it's one of those sort of drive home segments, and CBC is the public broadcaster. So the sort of the segment covers video games and different aspects of it. And one of the
awesome
one of the ones I did was on games being developed within the province of Alberta. And someone had previously at CBC done a feature on Dead Matter, and they were talking about that it was set within Alberta, and I thought, well, this is interesting, and so I did a little bit more research. I got in touch with Nick, and he did an interview for that segment, and then we had a sort of ensuing conversation, and we talked about the game audio, and at first he was kind of hesitant to ask me if I was willing to sort of help out, but I was like, absolutely, because I really enjoy sort of that small team. I've worked on AAA games with hundreds of people working on them, and it's fun, but there's just something a little bit more personal about working on small teams. And so he asked me if I'd be willing to come on board, and it was on like a sort of a contract basis, and I said yes. And for a while, for quite a I had other things to finish up, so I didn't really start heavily diving into the game until like late 2019. But now I'm pretty well, not necessarily full-time, but close to full-time working on the game.
Yeah, that's awesome. So that's really interesting how, like, I don't think I've heard a story that I guess kind of so far from game design in a way, like how you came onto the team, like having your own segment on a radio show and talking about the game itself, and then that attaching to the game. That's really cool. Like I know a lot of the people have just straight up joined the team because of their past work, and just reaching out to Nick and things like that. So that's really cool. It came about that way.
Yeah, and to be honest, I mean, I've tried to help Nick as much as possible in terms of industry contacts. We ended up going to Reboot develop Red last fall in Banff, which was a video game conference. It had been his first one. Just networking, making connections for him, helping him find people. Just being in the industry as long as I have been, I've built up a network of people that I know that do certain things.
Absolutely.
So whenever possible, I'll connect the team. Also just learning from my experience in terms of what not to do. I was audio director at Hinterland for a few years. They're the company that makes The Long Dark, which is also surrounded.
No way.
yeah, the survival game. It's it's a slightly different sort of subgenre. It's like there's no zombies or anything like that. It's just
Yeah.
basically player against the environment.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, so there's like a sort of a background of connecting with industry people and sort of being I enjoy sort of finding friends and acquaintances that have skill sets that are complementary and they need
Yeah.
they're working together. For instance, there's a musician that a very good friend of mine who's a musician. I can't really talk about it yet because there hasn't been a formal announcement,
Of
but
course.
yeah, that we've been talking to a bit because I think it's so important that Dead Matter has a recognizable brand in terms
Hmm.
of an audio signature, and as other people have in the past, if you have a composer and a sound designer working together, you kind of sort of complement each other and make it work together on a whole new level.
Yeah.
I was fortunate enough at the Reboot conference to sit in on a talk by Austin Wintory, who's done quite a few soundtracks. But my favorite of his so far is the one to the PS3 game Journey. And
Oh, yes, I've heard a lot about Journey, actually. I've never played it myself, but I've heard a lot about it.
well, if you have the opportunity, I would highly recommend it. It's not that long. I mean, you can literally finish an entire gameplay session in a couple hours. But
Hmm.
the cool thing about what he did, what the company that made that game allowed him to do, was work with the sound design team so that everything in that game is like in the same key. In the like, I mean, the keys move, but like tonally, the sound effects and the music are they work together.
Wow, that's really
So,
unique.
oh, it's incredible. Like the whole, if you ever get the chance to
Hmm.
read anything on the music system and everything they did in that game, it's awesome.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, and I think that it's important ultimately, for Dead Matter to have that kind of audio signature. So, I would like to sort of work towards that too. Cross our fingers, down the
Hmm.
road, looking at, new content and sequels and things like that, just to make sure that when people hear, sound from the game, when they hear a musical theme from the game, they immediately recognize it.
Oh,
And I think that's
absolutely.
important. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, all the big titles have their own like unique sound design and background, music and things like that. That when you hear it, you do recognize it. I mean, like you think about like AAA titles, like all of them have that. Like,
Yeah.
and I think that's really important because it does, like you say, it helps you recognize. You're like, oh, that's from whatever game, and it is important. So it's awesome to hear as well that you're connecting the team with with these people that they might need to get in touch with, because I know from my it totally different sector, but obviously with my background in content creation so far, a lot of that is just being connected to the right people and making friendships with other people, either in content creation, whether it's developers, whether it's sponsors, or people that are going to get you like the chance to play like a free game or something like that. There's all these types of contacts and things that you make along the way, and it's incredibly important. So I think like with that, I can imagine it's the same starting up as a dev company and working on your your first project. It could be equally as difficult to get in touch with the right people. So it's really good that they've got somebody like yourself with so much experience and networking ability, I guess, to kind of put them in touch with the right people, at least in the sound design department. So
Yeah. And and that's, like, I understand on small teams. Like there's another distinction between small teams and large teams, is that large teams have everybody doing specific jobs.
Hmm.
I mean, not saying there isn't any sort of lateral movement or advancement in those companies, but for the most part, if you're a tools programmer, you're a tools programmer. If you're a technical artist, you're a technical artist. And that's basically it.
Hmm.
You won't have a lot of influence on the marketing or the social media or anything like that. Whereas in smaller teams, you tend to wear more hats.
Hmm.
Pardon me. Sorry, I just got a little bit of
No,
allergies right
you're
now.
absolutely fine. I'm in exactly the same boat as the moment. Believe me. I go through this every spring.
Yeah,
Every
it's
spring.
allergy season. But that's one thing that I really admire about Nick. He's a young guy,
Hmm.
but he has taken on this huge project, and he's gotten it this far with very little experience. And he wears a lot of hats, but I also and he gets this, and I'm sure that he got it before I came along. But I expressed to him the importance of delegation as the company grows, because at some point you can't do everything. Something has to give, so it'll either
Absolutely.
be your sanity or the quality of your work, or something. So and that's what he's doing. I mean, he's done a good job in terms of hiring people on the team that are doing incredible work. Every time I see a new update to the game, I'm amazed that this is done by a first time team. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of rough edges, but honestly, there's also a lot of stuff there that is very close to what I'd consider AAA.
Yeah.
It's definitely in what we can sort of have developed, which is like a double A category, which is
Yeah.
above a basement indie, but not quite a large budget game.
Yeah,
So
absolutely. I think it's incredible what they've managed to make so far, and I've actually got kind of in the weeks to come as we get closer to the closed alpha, in which is currently planned for June. I've got something in the works which is like a comparison video between the earlier vlogs footage that we've seen from the game, where compared against stuff from say vlog 10, vlog 11, and talking about
right.
how things have improved. And I honestly didn't notice. You don't quite notice how far the game has come in that time until you compare it side by side, and
Oh yeah.
it's honestly astounding that they've managed to bring it this far, for their first, like you say, for their first project, which is amazing. So a lot of
Yeah, well,
admiration
I
for the
mean,
team.
I've been through that so many times. Some of the original pitch demos at BioWare were just brutal and rough.
Yeah.
Actually, it's kind of funny because the what eventually became Baldur's Gate started off as a martial arts game uh,
Really?
called Five Fingers of Death.
Wow.
And
Okay.
yeah, and then Interplay, had worked with them on Shattered Steel, and
Hmm.
then said, "Hey, we have the Dungeons and Dragons license," which wasn't a really big thing then. RPGs were kind of everybody was declaring RPGs dead,
Yeah.
and so they said, "Are you interested?" And that's kind of where it started. For
That's awesome.
instance, The Long Dark originally was going to be like a top-down sort of adventure style game
Hmm.
where what you did wrote a narrative, so you actually at the end would end up with this sort of short story of your journey.
Ah, okay.
um, and so things do change over time, and look at the quality when you start and then the quality when you're finished. And like you said, it's, it's kind of gradual and you don't notice it, but if you look at the beginning and the end, it's kind of stark.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't wait to see how the game progresses, especially as we come closer to closed alpha. Like I'm sure I speak for a lot of the community when I say like I'm incredibly excited to see how that is. And also kind of like I think it's the team of so far, at least in my perspective, have done a very good job of managing expectations as well, and making sure that people know that it's not going to be, you're not going to have all these things available, but what you do have available is going to be good. Which I think, is a very important thing.
And I think that, the old BioWare model was always difficult because, and it's not just BioWare, I'm not going to single them out, it's pretty endemic in the industry, is you promise, the moon, and then you keep having to sort of pare things back until, you end up in Florida. So, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not what you promised. Whereas I think the Dead Matter approach is kind of the way that I've always believed that game development should work, is that you get all of the basics working solidly, and then when you have time and everything's stable, people like it, the gameplay's good, then you start adding the frills and the icing on the cake. But if the cake is crap, then it doesn't matter how much icing you put on it.
Exactly.
And we've all seen so many games that are like that. I mean, they look beautiful, the trailers are awesome, but then the gameplay is just mediocre or worse, So, I think that the approach that the Dead Matter team is taking is very good, and it's kind of like under promise and over deliver, and you'll never disappoint people by giving them more than they expect.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your insight on that. That was really, really good. I loved how you put that as well. That was really cool. So it's fair to say that sound design is an incredibly important aspect of the game itself when it comes to especially survival titles. But if I could ask, why do you think that is? Like, how much of an impact do you think it has on a player's experience?
Well, sound design done right impacts people at a very visceral level. It's very subconscious, and I can give you an example that I really like. Have you ever played the Silent Hill games? I'm sure you're probably aware of them.
I am aware of them. I can't say I've played them, fortunately.
Well, Silent Hill 2, which is one of my favorite games of all time, has this audio-based game mechanic where the player has this radio, and the radio will be silent until an enemy comes within range. It's sort of like an audio, mini map, if you will.
Okay.
And the closer the enemy gets, the static gets louder, and then it starts layering in these creepy voices.
Oh wow!
And then when the enemy's on screen, it's like full on, like this creepy sounds coming out of it.
Yeah.
And that adds to the tension. But at first you notice it, but after a while, like, you just react on a gut level, and your adrenaline goes up, your anxiety goes up. And so it's like, so important to set the stage. One of the I also teach audio design occasionally, and one of the things I do as an exercise is I take a video. Usually I've got one that I like particularly. It's a video of a forest, and just sort of a I guess you would say like at a dog's eye level, whatever, walking through the forest. And I say, okay, I need you to give me 2 completely different moods. And most of the time, people will do like one happy, and it's kind of like birds chirping and, you know, little breeze and things like that. And then a lot of the times they'll do like a really creepy sort of eerie take where they'll have like, you know, kids laughing in the distance and sort of, you know, branches breaking, but nothing changes on the visual side. So the entire atmosphere is created by what the sound designer does, because I did that exercise to, you know, to show people that you really are working on a subconscious level and you need to understand how that affects people. So for instance, in a lot of sort of survival and horror games and stuff like that, they'll use like a drone sound or something similar, and they'll often use sort of like very dissonant sounds, like chords that don't really work, you know, musically, but they just, you know, they make people uneasy, and they may not understand why they feel uneasy, but they do, and that's, you know, part of the whole thing. Plus, you know, in a survival game like this, like Dead Matter, you want to believe the world that you're in. So, you know, the doors, like, you know, some people say, well, for instance, the footstep system, like, why would you spend a month redoing the footsteps? Well, the reason is because footsteps are something that everybody knows. We've all heard footsteps. It's something that happens all the time in the game. So if you make a footstep system that is too repetitive, that doesn't sound, you know, quite right, then it's something that annoys people. And so the reason why, even though honestly, like most people will play the game, won't think about it. It's just something that they think, oh, this is, you know, I'm walking on gravel, that's why it sounds like that. I'm walking on concrete, that's why it sounds like that. And they won't think about it. But the thought process behind it really has to sort of say, well, how can I make this so that it's, you know, reasonable in terms of resources, but also has enough variety and naturalness to it that, you know, the player doesn't feel like they're listening to canned sounds. For instance, the wood, walking on wood, like wooden floors and stuff like that. And everybody, you know, not everybody, but most people have walked on wooden floors, and every once in a while there'll be like not just a footfall, but like a creak, right? Because the wood, you know, is going to creak a little bit. And so in our system, we have the sounds of the foot on the floor, but then I also have sounds that layer in randomly playing creak sounds every once in a while to sort of add that layer of authenticity and variety, so that you end up, you know, feeling like, well, I'm walking on a real, you know, in an old house, I'm walking on a real wood floor that's creaky.
That's really cool.
Yeah, so I mean, that's part of the reason why sound design is important, especially in a game where you're trying to, you know, create sort of a sense of world and a sense of realism.
Yeah, I mean, especially in a game like Dead Matter, where there's potentially, you know, when you give an example of walking in an old house, right? Potentially when you're exploring that old house, there could be like a zombie around the corner or something hiding in one of the rooms. You don't want to be noticing that like the footstep sounds are a little bit out of place or don't quite sound right while you're there. You want them to be in the background and, like you say, still affecting your, I guess, the subconscious, but your focus is on the game, right? Your focus is being in that house. It's what's around the corner. It's like, you know, am I going to get something from going in here, you know, and it just adds that little bit of edge to it, especially with games like Dead Matter, where you're trying to be immersed, I guess, in the experience. So that's really cool.
Yeah, exactly.
So I must admit, I've no real working knowledge at all on this topic when it comes to sound design, And I'm sure many of the people watching this video could probably say the same. Can I ask if you create the sounds that go into Dead Matter yourself, or how does that kind of thing work exactly?
Well, because I've been doing this for so long, I've been fortunate enough to to have a lot of options at my disposal. Of course, I have libraries that I have purchased over the years and have access to.
Right.
I also have sounds that I have recorded myself. For instance, a lot of the stuff that was recorded for the Long Dark was recorded at a studio in Victoria, British Columbia, that specialized in Foley, which is Foley sort of like any human type sounds, like footsteps, clothes rustling, opening a cupboard, things like that.
Okay.
And then there are certain things that obviously I can't create on my own. I mean, there's a person that I know is in the sound design business. His name is Frank Bree. And he specializes in guns. Another gentleman I have, this friend of mine, his name is Watson Wu. He's worked on a lot of the Need for Speed games, and he works on car audio a lot, like vehicles and stuff like that. But he has access to Ferraris, Lamborghinis, M1 tanks, all these different things that I don't necessarily have access to, because that's his specialty. So in those cases, I'll turn to libraries, I'll turn to things that just aren't available for me to create sounds. But I'll do bespoke sounds when I need to, if I can't find something that really works for me. And the reason that you fall back on libraries is because obviously we're talking about limited budgets, limited time, and you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Like if you've got a wood chopping sound, you don't necessarily need to have a brand new wood chopping sound when you've already got some in your library. And lastly, there's a lot of good online resources. There's a site that I subscribe to called SoundSnap, and they're I think they're like over 230,000 sounds, and you just enter a search term, but you'd be surprised, like there's a lot of stuff that's like really mundane, that just no one's ever recorded and put in a library, because they figure, well, everybody can do this. So a lot of times I'll end up having to record because I figure, well, somewhere this should have it, but they don't. So,
I'm just now, like at this very moment, bookmarking SoundSnap, because I do obviously, like when I make YouTube content and stuff like that. Sometimes I'll throw in like the odd sound effect. Most of the time it's musical, and a lot of the time, unfortunately, you have to be very careful with like copyright and stuff like that. But I am bookmarking SoundSnap right now because I've been doing a bit more creative stuff recently, and I definitely want to remember that one.
They've got a nice model. It's like there's a pay per certain amount of sounds. So if you're only looking for a couple sounds per project or whatever, like a dozen sounds or something, then you just pay a small amount. Or you can go the full subscription, which is $200 a year, which gives you access to everything. So
awesome.
And there's obviously music libraries like that too. I know that it's pretty typical for a lot of developers to turn to music libraries, and that's understandable because music's not cheap. Bespoke music is it's a lot of work. The downside of that is that a lot of times you'll end up with something very generic sounding, or something that someone has heard multiple times before. And it's funny because I have heard music from Baldur's Gate used in other things. There was like a battle, one of the battle themes was in this commercial once.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, and I just was like, oh my God, why does this sound familiar? And then I realized, I was like, oh my God, that's like battle theme number 3. And so either the composer retained rights to relicense it, or maybe Interplay did. I know there's a lot of companies, publishers out there that will license out content, to try to get the most out of it. So
Yeah.
it just depends. But I think ultimately, you use whatever resources you can afford and whatever, works. You'd want to, if time and money was no object, of course you'd want to do everything on your own. But that's just not the way the world works.
Yeah, of course. I must yeah, it's really cool hearing about this, because I imagine that when you're playing games yourself nowadays, with your experience in mind, you, like you say, you probably recognize things every so often, or you pay a little bit more attention even to just like the sound design that goes into the game.
God.
I bet it's a curse at times, right? Like,
have you ever, you've played Doom, I assume, right? The original
yes.
Doom?
Yes.
Okay, the elevator sound, that
yes.
that is in everything. Like, just listen, just go back and find a clip of Doom or whatever, and then especially in like science fiction movies and things like that, that sound gets used everywhere. And it's just so annoying because it just breaks me right out. It's from a library that's like, oh God, by now it's like 30 years old, called the General 6000 Library.
Really?
And yeah, and it's like people say it's the Doom door sound.
Yeah.
And that's not what it is, but that is, what people come to know it as.
Yeah.
I remember Reznor did a lot of the sound design for Quake, the original Quake. And some of the sounds in there are straight out of that library as well.
Yeah.
And so you hear them, and then you hear them in other contexts, and it's kind of, for me anyway, because I'm very attuned to the audio. So, and then of course there's the infamous Wilhelm scream.
Yes, I was about to mention that I hear that everywhere, and I must admit, even like myself with no background in sound design at all, like when you hear it nowadays, it's like, really, again? Like, you hear that so often.
It's kind of a, I know a lot of people get pissed off at it, but I don't. I think it's funny because, I think at this point, I mean, I've used it. I think at this point, it's kind of like this, the sound designers sort of like, screw you sort of thing, to the haters, because, let's be honest, the sound design is kind of the redheaded stepchild of the industry.
Yeah.
It's funny because, and I still give him a hard time about this on occasion, but Ray Zika, who was one of the other owners of BioWare, once said that in an interview that sound design was like 50% of the experience of any game. And I said, well, then how come I only get 10% of the budget? So, and that's the way it is. And it's the same in other mediums as well. As a matter of fact, and I notice in video game media, they kind of lump, dialogue and music and sound effects all go under one thing. And, I know maybe it's just my perspective, but there's a big difference, between the three. And there's I know that there's an organization that I'm a part of, and it's called, it's a ridiculous acronym, but it's called GANG. It's the Game Audio Network Guild. And they
Okay.
have awards. They have awards at GDC every year, and yeah, and they, because it's audio oriented, they separate. They have music categories. Then they even have like different music categories. They have like licensed music and original music. They have sound effects. They have dialogue. They have like best actor and things like that. Because and I get it because obviously they'll lump like best graphics together when it's really there's visual effects in the graphics, there's texturing, there's modeling, there's animation, so
Hmm.
it's kind of a hard thing because how sort of discrete and granular do you want to get. But I hope that when people do think about audio, that they think that there are discrete elements that sort of on a good game and on a good team they work together.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely understand. I mean, I can imagine. So, what gets me is like the budget being, I guess, so small for sound design. That's like that hits me. Like even having no experience in it. But I guess, like you say, that's the same with a lot of other sectors too, right? Is
Yeah,
just one particular area just doesn't get the same amount of support and funding.
yeah.
I
I
guess.
mean, it doesn't get credit or budget proportionate to its impact. But you know, there are developers that are better and worse when it comes to that,
Sure.
and I would say that Nick and the Dead Matter team are pretty cognizant of how important audio is, and it's reflected in in
Sure.
how they treat it, and
Awesome.
how I work with
That's
them.
that's good to hear. That's really good to hear. I have to ask, what particular challenges have you faced when so far, if any, when working with Dead Matter and the sound design kind of associated? Is there anything that's been particularly difficult at all?
Well, I mean, for the most part, I operate in two different ways. When I'm either brought in near the end and just given a list of audio needs and
Hmm.
maybe some reference material. I create sound design, go back and forth a couple times on things, and then I hand it off. It's a black box. Or I'm early in the process, so I develop all the things from the beginning, the naming conventions, the hierarchy, the organization in terms of like the files and things like that, the priorities. But there's a unique problem with Dead Matter, is that I was brought in when there was already an existing sort of audio structure there.
Hmm.
And because it was a little bit of a, you know, sort of cobbled together, and it didn't seem like there's a lot of like sort of set rules for that, then the challenge is that there are things in different places and named differently and things like that. So part of my challenge, and it's boring, but has been to basically try to like bring all of that into an organizational structure that is easier for me and for anyone else to find what we need to in terms of audio resources.
Sure.
So
So you're
that's
kind of like reorganizing what's already there before you're able to kind of like properly dive into it,
yeah. I
if you
mean,
like.
I have to know what we have before I can change anything. And so
Sure.
that's what I've been doing. I mean, and I go in and if sounds are not working for me, like I said, I replace them. Or if there's if like somebody's using a stereo sound where they should only be using a mono sound, then I'll fix that, and all kinds of little things like that. So I mean, it's important to keep things organized in terms of understanding you know priorities, what the workflow is, and just basically keeping your sanity, because at first there aren't a lot of assets to deal with, but by the end of the project, you know I I will probably, you know, have hundreds, possibly thousands of assets that are in the game. And so, you know, I have to know, you know, because sometimes things get deprecated. So I have to know, are these things no longer used? Like I just went through about a week of cleanup. You know, things broke, we fixed them, but you know, there was like a bunch of things that were made for tests and demos and things like
Sure.
that are just in the assets but no longer needed. So I'm like, okay, well, let's get rid of these, because you know, if I'm doing a search and I don't want to see these things come up that are no longer being used in the game, it just clutters things up.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's like stepping into to any workplace, I guess, where someone's been in that office before you. Right. Everything is completely designed differently to how you would want it. Usually you end up shifting stuff around, whether it's like, you know, how all of your folders are categorized or whatever it is, or just how things are done around you, right? Like you have to get used to what's going on and restructure everything, reorganize. So yeah, I can definitely understand where you're coming from on that. So yeah, that's really cool. Thank you for the insight on that.
Yeah, no problem.
So I want to kind of focus on one particular part of the sound, and we have kind of touched on this a little bit already with the footsteps, but sound can be an absolute game changer when it comes to player versus player, like interactions. So how much can we expect the sound design in Dead Matter to actually affect combat itself, I guess?
Well, I mean, one thing that we've talked about that's incredibly important is being aware of other players and of enemy, like the zombies, where we want, you know, like you brought up the example of being in a house and then hearing footsteps and then not knowing, okay, who is that? You know, is that a foe, or is it a you know, a friendly or a foe? You know, and also, you know, doing things like, let's say, the amount of things you're carrying in your inventory. Well, in real life, you know, if you're carrying a lot of crap, then it's going to make more noise,
Yeah,
and
of
so
course.
you'll be easier to hear, and so that's going to affect gameplay. You know, so
Okay.
other people can hear you, the creatures can hear you. You know, if you're going to run, especially, it's going to be a lot louder.
Awesome.
So ultimately, you know, sound will absolutely affect gameplay in terms of, you know, what is being heard by the player will sort of guide their action. Like, you know, you mentioned a bullet being, you know, you mentioned a shot being fired. And, you know, that's part of the, you know, if you hear a battle going on, that's part of, you know, the gameplay. Is it like, do I avoid that, or do I jump in and try to pick up some spoils, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, for instance, there was a big change in the way that audio was done in the Battlefield franchise when they moved to this, I guess you could say, like a realism-based model, where they, like, I don't know how much Battlefield you've played, but
Quite a
in
lot, actually, over the years. Yeah, I was a big
yeah,
fan.
but I mean, when you started to hear, like, previously the sort of paradigm was, in a game like that you would have kind of a background, you know, sort of melange of different sounds going off: explosions, gunfire, people
Sure.
yelling. But that was all canned, you know, it would fire randomly, so it sounded a little more natural. But then, you know, the people at DICE decided, well, we're gonna go out there and we're gonna, you know, make it more realistic. And so the sounds that you hear in the game of combat in the distance are actually generated by the game audio engine by real players, you know, battling. And then they, you know, and then they filtered it so that it sounds realistic in terms of like reflecting off of buildings and things like that, and how
Wow.
sound changes over distance.
Oh, that's really
And
cool.
yeah, and part of what we're looking at now is Unreal 5 has this, but they just also added it into the 4.5 engine, where they use something called Convolution Reverb. Now, what Convolution Reverb is that you basically take a profile of a space using what's called an impulse file. So, you set off a loud sound, and then you record the sort of, ensuing trail and reflections. And then you use that, pardon me, you use that to create a reverb profile, so that when you map that to a space like a warehouse, and then when players make noise in that warehouse, then the reflections that they hear, the reverb that they hear, is not just something that's calculated, by, like artificial algorithms. It's actually based on a real space.
Wow.
So it sounds a lot more natural. So that is, something that we want to get in there.
That's awesome.
I'm not sure if it'll make it in by the closed alpha, but
of course,
it's definitely on the menu. So
yeah, I must admit, when I've watched some of the vlogs in the past, one of the main things I was quite excited for was the fact that, like, I think what the demonstration that was given was standing outside of a warehouse and then stepping into it. Things sound completely different, whether it's your footsteps and even voice, like when you're talking over the microphone, that changes. And that was really cool. Really like that.
Yeah, and once again, that's one of those things that just happens naturally in the background, but adds to the immersive factor. So
sure, yeah, absolutely. So that's really cool to know that the little things like that are going to affect PvP. Kind of like you said, with the heavier the more stuff you're carrying, you're going to make more noise, stuff like that. I think for me, coming from Escape from Tarkov, it's had a lot of criticisms and a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? A lot of like good things said about its sound design as well. For example, one of the main things, and I think I've talked about this in a past interview as well. One of the main things with Tarkov right now is that when you're say like you've got like a multi-story building, you can't necessarily hear somebody. Forget which way round it is because I haven't played in a while, but if it's like somebody's above you, you might not hear them, but if somebody is below you, you will. And it's a very backwards kind of system that they've got right now. And especially when you come up the stairs, it's like the audio doesn't fade in. It just all of a sudden, that person is on the same floor as you, you can hear them. There's no like gradual fade in. And you notice that. Like that's, especially for somebody that plays it quite often, you notice that. And it does kind of throw you off. And it heavily affects your combat as well. So I think like things like that are really important for gameplay, because you don't necessarily want someone who's frustrated with that whole situation because they haven't heard someone coming when they perhaps should have, or they've been thrown off by, I can't work out where this guy is, because I can't tell which direction the sound's coming from, or stuff like that. And I think things like that are really underrated sometimes. So it's good to know, I guess, that Dead Matter is putting a bit of thought into all of that, because it signals the right things, I guess.
Well, credit where credit's due as well is that the Epic team is really paying attention to the audio. I know a few people on the audio team over there, and they really care, and they make sure that the sound is a priority in terms of the development pipeline of the Unreal Engine, and they like the new features like the Convolution Reverb are getting added in, along with the all the new graphical features and things like that.
Awesome.
But it's also important, absolutely, that they develop systems where the sound is propagated, as realistically as it can be. There's obviously some programming that still has to be done on our end. Like, I don't know if you noticed, but like when there's wind, if you go behind an object and the direction of the wind is on the other side of that object, then the wind sound sort of diminishes in volume and is also sort of filtered down a little bit.
Oh,
And
awesome.
yeah, and that's something that I sort of started working with on the Long Dark. Just this idea that the environment is kind of a character too, so you have to do little things like that because that's what people expect, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you're in a blizzard and you get shelter behind a truck, then you expect the wind sound to diminish, and
Yeah.
it's once again, just back to the philosophy of it adding to the experience, but not necessarily standing out per se.
Yeah, exactly. That's something that I've never noticed. So that's a really good example. Because I definitely haven't noticed anything like that. So that's really cool. And I think a lot of people will be very interested to know about this as well. The people listening to this are probably in the same boat as me. Just some people have just never noticed these things before. And now probably maybe they will. So that's really cool. So that's kind of my main questions that I had related to sound design, but I do kind of like to kind of end my interviews with a couple of quick questions just about Dead Matter and yourself as well. I have to ask, what are you most looking forward to personally when it comes to Dead Matter? And you can be biased, I understand it might be the sound design.
To be honest, I'm actually looking forward to the idea that you can kind of develop, your own sort of communities and groups.
Yes.
And then kind of, go to war with other groups and that dynamic, which is, something that would, most likely happen in real life as well. So, that's something that I'm really looking forward to playing in. So when you have enough players to make that happen, I think it's going to be an interesting dynamic. And like all gameplay, there will be things that emerge. There's always, like the rocket jump sort of thing where it was not something designed in, but it was something players learned to do. And I'm sure that we'll have, instances like that grow out of the game. But definitely, I would say, the sort of tribal mechanic, depending on what you want to call it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm super looking forward to how that's going to play out on our server as well, because we're fully intending on making a couple of servers. I think we're looking at one for EU and one for NA at the moment. Yeah, I'm really excited to see what kind of stories unfold, because I think 90% of the people that end up playing on our servers are going to be people that I might already know. And it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of storylines come out of it and what groups get formed with who and who goes, like you say, goes to war with this group, and how that's going to also play in with the factions that are already in the game, that are pre-generated, those AI factions, and what kind of happens there as well.
Well, you're going to find out who the assholes are.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, I have don't get me wrong, I have a feeling that my mods from Twitch are probably going to be the ones in the enemy group rather than siding with me, knowing them. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. Really looking forward to it. And my last question for you is, what kind of survivor do you think you're going to be?
That is a really difficult question. Could you give me a little more context?
Yeah, so Reggie, for example, I think it was Reggie that said he's going to be a bit of a nomad. So he's gonna be living out in the sticks, and he's gonna go kind of traveling, and he's gonna never be in the same spot for a given amount of time. Nick said that he was a bandit. He's killing everybody that gets in his way. that sort of thing. If that gives you any context to that.
I'm kind of a hunker down, establish a strong base and snipe people from a distance kind of guy. I want to avoid close-up trouble as much as possible. So that's probably me. I like sort of, that role where it's not, kind of a support role. So
yeah,
that's probably me. I'm probably going to be the guy holed up in the cabin. But the downside of that is that if people figure out where you are and a large enough group comes in, then you're kind of screwed.
Yeah, no, I absolutely get that. I mean, I know a lot of the gameplay that I want to have is just the way that the game works. I love the idea of the basing. I love the idea of like the claiming buildings for your own and having to use pre-established structures. And again, it kind of plays into this immersion thing. But also having the ability to go like away from structures if you want to and play, kind of on the move, and set up camps and use vehicles to carry your stuff around and all the rest of it. And I love how that's going to play out. So I think me personally, I'm looking forward to both sides of it.
And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about emergent gameplay. We'll find out pretty quick what people really like to do. And hopefully there'll be a nice variety because, playing first-person shooters and things in the past, it sucks when you get on a server where everybody's a camper, obviously, right?
Yeah.
Or if you get on the server where everybody's like a cowboy and just guns a-blazing with no strategy at all.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I'm a big fan of co-op gameplay. As a matter of fact, over the last few years, I've sort of transitioned out of the PvP as much. I mean, I still play Modern Warfare, but even in Modern Warfare and things like that, I'm playing, with a team of people that I know against other people. So that co-op element of it, I just like working. I like working with other people on a team because it's just more fun that way. I mean, sure, you can jump on a server with strangers and get similar experiences, but it's not as fun when you're like sharing and I know from the past. I mean, I'm not formally in any clans or anything like that, but I know from the past playing games with my friends, when we're operating as a group, we're far more deadly than we are as individuals on the same team.
Sure. And I think that's going to play into Dev Matter quite heavily as well. It's just because of the way that the game is built. These people that already know each other and are able to build like an established, whatever it is, whether it's a base or a group that roams around, are going to be much more effective. So I think we're also going to have this like building relationships with people in the game as well. Maybe not quite being able to trust them quite as much as the guys that you already know.
Right.
So I think it's going to play kind of both sides there, but that's awesome.
If Eve has taught people anything with online gaming, is you can never trust anyone 100%.
Man, that game is something else, but I'll leave that discussion for another day. Dave, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
Thoroughly looking forward to the closed alpha and perhaps, now paying a little bit more attention to the sound design in the game and hearing what you've worked on.
Okay, well, I appreciate you talking to me.
No problem at all. My pleasure. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.